So I'm here with the authors of Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution by Claire Bellerjeau and Tiffany Yecke Brooks, a book which reveals the true story of Liss, an enslaved woman who helped turn George Washington's spy into an abolitionist. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
Oh, great. Thanks for having us on.
Oh, thank you so much. One of the things I was really interested was the foreword of the book is written by Vanessa Williams. I guess this came about because, Claire, you met her at the Oyster Bay Historical Society at an event that involved her ancestors. Could you discuss her connections to Oyster Bay and how she came to write the foreword?
Yeah, absolutely. Vanessa has deep historic connections to the story of Liss, which is so exciting for us. And we are so grateful to Vanessa for being involved in our book and for writing our foreword and for possibly taking the story even further into our culture. I met her when she had come to Oyster Bay when they were designating historically African-American graveyard where some of her ancestors are buried. She was part of the group that made it a historic landmark. And so that was the day when it was getting its landmark status announced. And so I knew she was going to be at this meeting, and I had done some research about her ancestors. She had actually been on the TV show that talks about family genealogy, and they had searched back to find her ancestor, David Carl, who was a Civil War soldier. But I was able to look even deeper into the records and find her ancestors in the period when slavery was legal. So I was able to share that with her and then share Liss's story with her. And we were so grateful that she got involved in our story.
Wow, it's incredible. And, knowing that she has a connection to the story, I think makes it all the more interesting. I was reading, it said a King James version of the Bible started the discussion about the people who were slaves of the Townsend family.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the primary sources you used for the book and if it was anything you wanted to include but couldn't because you couldn't find the information reliable or otherwise.
Well, I was very invested in the idea of research and that everything we said in the book, we would be very upfront about what the source material was for it and how sure we could be. And so even though that Bible that you mentioned was our first primary piece of the puzzle, it actually took me years to understand what that record really meant. So I had to take that piece of paper and really examine it and think about it, because that Bible record wasn't as clear cut as it looked in the beginning. And so with some of the research, it actually took time to put puzzle pieces together and to re-examine evidence that had already been discovered and to look at it in a new light when you found other pieces of evidence. So
one of the things that I think was so interesting about this project was that it really was an ongoing project. So, I mean, we were within a week of it going to press, and Claire suddenly found one more little thing in the primary sources. And to me, that's part of what makes this book so exciting, is that it is telling an untold story. It is helping to give a voice to someone who had her voice taken from her. And so often we think of these records and these people as having their stories lost, and they have been. But I think the research that Claire did shows that some of these stories are still out there and can be, reconstructed, at least to some small degree. But it takes a lot of elbow grease and sleuthing. And I mean, Claire worked on this for 16 years. So, I mean, that's a lot of lines to draw, of connections to make, of surprising primary sources to find, because, so little about this was known before. So this really was detective work, uncovering all of this and making these connections between these various primary sources that were in collections literally all over the country.
Yeah.
Claire, Tiffany just said that you worked on the book for 16 years. So I was wondering, how soon before you knew that this could actually be a book?
That was many years down the line. I remember that moment when I first read the letters that really told the heart of her story. It was because of that Bible that I had decided to do an exhibit on slavery in Oyster Bay. And I had reached out to the East Hampton Library, just casually asking them, do you have anything in your collection that might relate to slavery? That was so long ago, Ryan, that they sent a photocopied piece of paper through a fax machine, okay? And when it came out the other end, it was almost black. It was almost unreadable with this photocopy and then fax mess. And it took days before I was even told that it had arrived in the fax machine. I sat on this little historic stairwell in the museum trying to read this piece of paper. And as these words were revealed to me, I got chills. I knew from that first moment, this story is important. This story is going to change America. But I didn't know it would be a book probably for 10 years.
Wow. That's incredible. And the story is terrific as well. Robert Townsend was a member of the Culper Spy Ring, a network of spies organized by General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And Townsend received information from a female spy known as number 355. You believe it was Liss. Can you describe how you uncovered this information?
Well, Tiffany and I are pretty upfront about this in the book. See, spies were really afraid of getting caught. If they got caught, the method of punishment was execution by hanging. So they really didn't want to be caught. And so they were incredibly sneaky in their communications. The fact that this female spy is even mentioned really broke the rules of proper spying.
Right.
So the spy, who's named Abraham Woodhull, Culper Sr., he mentioned her only one time in one letter amongst hundreds of letters, and she was never mentioned again. So the idea that we could ever prove exactly who 355 was is probably never going to happen because there won't be corroborating evidence. But I like people to think about the timing. Liss escaped with a British regiment led by Colonel Simcoe, and that happened in the spring of '79. We know that she then lived in Manhattan, and the spy Robert Townsend was also in Manhattan that summer of '79. And by August, this first mention of 355 happens. And the mention of the spy, the lady, says that she will outwit them all. So it means it's a woman who has some sort of advantage of being sneaky in a way that's unexpected. Now, an enslaved person would have been able to move in and out of rooms, overhearing people in a way that made her almost invisible. And it's terrible that a person would be considered without their personhood. But for Liss, it might have given her an edge to be a spy. Now, we know that she and the spy Robert had contact during the time he was a spy because of entries in his ledger book, where he buys a few things for her on a couple of instances. But other than that, we'll never be able to prove it, and I would just like it if people would consider Liss as a possibility for 355. I think Liss should be in the running, and maybe at the top of the list.
Yes. And it's interesting too, because Robert's last Liss, at some point, as we may get to in the discussion, does end up actually moving in to Robert's home, and Robert's last spy letter occurs within a month of that. So there are really some, oh goodness, sorry. There really are some interesting, it's circumstantial evidence, but like Claire said, she should be considered. Her name should be absolutely on the list of possible contenders of women who may have undertaken this extremely brave and daring role.
I think another reason why it's possible that she was part of the intelligence network, if not this woman 355, then part of it in some other way, is that Robert leaves out vital details about her. And he's also very connected to her and her child in ways that seem above and beyond if she were just anyone to him, you know?
You mentioned that, and in the book you make a point that he never marries. Robert Townsend, he never marries. Why do you think that is?
You know, he wasn't the only person in his family that never married. But it's true. And there are several letters where other relatives are busting on him for that. They're saying, Robert, why won't you marry? That is God's plan for us all. But if you refuse, I at least hope that you will make yourself useful or play a role in society. Robert did not want to play a role in society, and that could have had something to do with his abolitionist beliefs. I think he felt that the rules were unfair, and he didn't want to be a part of them. He didn't want to just be a socialite like so many other wealthy people were. He really discarded that. He came from a very influential family. His father was a New York state senator, reelected 5 times over, and a very important patriot leader before the war. His older brother was also a New York state politician. So he came from this very powerful family, but he chose to do none of that. And he was never attached to, we never even hear of him having a romance with a woman.
And it's interesting too, in a number of his later writings, private writings and journals, we see passages that he copied that are really rather melancholy. And it seems, judging from letters that other family members wrote him, one of his brothers-in-law sends him a letter talking about how terrible it is that he is, feeling sad or not, like Claire said, not being useful. He's like, you should go down and thresh some of my land and help me clear it out and all this stuff. Like, basically he just berates him for being it seems like he could be possibly depressed. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to see the stigma that any kind of, what we consider today mental health challenges carried in the 18th century. It's heartbreaking to see the way some people's family members speak to him in letters about his personal choices that he makes with his life, his emotional, situation. It deepens the understanding of Robert, because I think his story so often just gets distilled down to he was a spy, but we don't really think about what happened after the war ended. And there's so much more depth to his character, and you really see a man who's wrestling with a lot of inner turmoil.
All along the way, both Liss and Robert try to make choices that they think are going to help themselves. Liss tries to find her freedom, and she makes choices. She chooses not to evacuate to Canada at the end of the war, even though African Americans who had been enslaved were being promised freedom in Canada by the British. She instead, as a person who was 3 months pregnant, wanted to stay in New York and asked for Robert's help that she could stay here. And sometimes I wonder, well, what would have happened if she would have gone to Canada? Maybe she would have had a more successful life up there. Because as the readers will find out, the terrible things happen to her because of the choices that she makes and the choices that others make. And so, in fictional stories, your plot just sort of goes up and it does the predictable thing. In real life, it's much more exciting and much more treacherous because the decisions that they make take them down some very dark roads, both of them.
Right. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed, is that you don't give off the impression that slavery in the North was more humane. Can you talk about some of the punishment that, slaves would receive if they...
I did some original research on this that was truly shocking. First of all, most people do not know that of all the northern colonies, so the colonies above Maryland, New York by far had the most slavery. In fact, in 1770, so right before the Revolutionary War, if you added up all the slavery in all of the New England colonies and added them together, New York had more. Far more than Pennsylvania, even more than Georgia in 1770. So New York was a very big slave hub of the North. And in 1730, they enacted a law in New York that I had never heard of before I found it in my research. There was a law that every town had to appoint a paid slave whipper. Every town in New York, including Oyster Bay and every other town, had a central whipping post specifically for enslaved people to be whipped. And this law even said how much they would get paid, which would be the equivalent in today's money of $25 per whipping. Then I got even more frightful entries that I found in a blacksmith's book. So I found one 1755 entry in an Oyster Bay blacksmith book where he's repairing the stocks and the shackles, which have been used so much that they need repair. And then an 1802 record. So 1802 is past the time when supposedly New York had begun gradual emancipation. That was supposed to have begun in 1799. But this 1802 blacksmith book shows a man being paid to shackle, to collar a black person, and to put chains, what they called wearing irons, on their arms and legs, and to have an attached ring, an iron ring that's going to go and attach to something else. And then quite a few years after that, in 1809, a really horrific record of this same blacksmith being paid to literally attach a black person to a wagon wheel to be beaten. This comes from a medieval torture called breaking on the wheel that goes back to medieval times. But in 1809, in the center of the town of Oyster Bay, this was being done to a black person.
It's so, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, go. You go.
No, I was gonna say it was so, I mean, heartbreaking and disturbing to read these actual accounts, because you're realizing, like, you know, when you see it in the newspaper print of the day, you're realizing, like, this isn't something hypothetical. You're reading something that happened, like, on an actual day to an actual human being. You know, it takes it from that hypothetical idea of history and makes it so much realer. And one of the goals we have for this book was to highlight the fact that too often we think of American history in very binary terms of North was free, South had slaves. And what this story shows is not only did the North have slaves, but how deeply embedded slavery was in the culture and the everyday life of the colonies in the North. And it's not something that Northerners in America can't point to slavery and say, that was your problem, American South. Mm-hmm. Like this was everyone's problem. This was something that everyone partook in. Mm-hmm. And it was distressing, but also very enlightening to see just how real and normalized. I think that was part of what was shocking, how normalized it was in life in the North, which we traditionally tend to think of as, oh, well, that was free. That's where slaves were trying to get with Harriet Tubman. Well, yes.
Much later.
That's much later. Exactly. Let's look at this early American history, and we see that there's those hard lines that we like to draw there's so much more nuance.
I'll tell you, Ryan, when I found those two records, the 1802 and the 1809 records, I only found them last year. It was because this ledger book had been scanned and I could zoom in and really read it for the first time. It's in the archives at Raynham Hall Museum, which is Liss's birthplace and Robert Townsend's birthplace. It's a museum. But this particular blacksmith's book really hadn't been looked at before by anybody. And I had to read through many, many pages before I found those two entries, and they were written as if they were nothing. They were just 12 nails and putting it on as an extra charge for the breaking on the wheel entry. Putting a band and a bolt on a black. That's how the collaring entry read. Strapping a black for a welt to a wagon tire. That's how the other one read. And 12 nails and putting it on as an extra fee.
Wow. You know, I was really surprised, like, you know, how deep you go into the historical details. It's an incredible book. And one of the things I was really surprised was, like, in 1641, there was a Puritan law called Body of Liberties, which was established in Massachusetts as the first colony to legally legalize slavery. I think you call it in the book ironic. Can you speak a little bit about that contradiction?
Do you remember that one, Tiffany? That is so ironic, because this was the law that made it so that when you had children, they would also be enslaved. So the moment that a mother gave birth to her child, that child was instantly owned by her master.
And one of the things that's so interesting when you look at slavery laws in early American history, you see everyone restricts things further and further and further. And you see this growing anxiety of this need to say, we need to codify these rules. We need to make sure that there is no ambiguity as to citizenship, as to freedom. You know, it's the laws are just a continual restriction on freedom. As you see, there's more and more of an anxiety of, we need to assert what these people can and cannot do, and who you know, who they are and who they are not. And it's chilling to see how each law tightens that, makes those restrictions even more distinct and stronger, as there's a sense of, you know, we have to crack down on this. And it's
and no more does that become clear than in this 1799 law, when New York was supposed to be becoming emancipated, right? But what that 1799 law really did was put a timer on when slavery was going to end. It was going to end 28 years later. Imagine we make a law today. We're going to give you rights, Ryan, in 28 years.
but only if your age falls between certain ranges. And
so women then had to wait until they were 25 to even be eligible to become free, and men had to wait until they were 28 to even be eligible to be considered for freedom. It's just so restrictive. And then the day when it finally legally ended in New York, believe it or not, was July 4th. July 4th, 1827. So when you're celebrating July 4th this year, and when all your listeners are enjoying July 4th, I want them to remember that as the Emancipation Day of slavery in New York, July 4th.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much, Claire and Tiffany. What do you want readers to take away from the book?
Oh, so much. There's so much detail in there. I want them to think of Liss as a new founding figure. I want Liss to be right up there with George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and John Jay. I want an African-American woman who had so much courage to seek her freedom to be a founding member of American history. And I want all children in school to learn her story just as they're learning everyone else's story. So we can have a representative of all of these forgotten people in our founding story of America.
And to build on to that, as sort of a yes and to what Claire's saying, I'd also like to see people think about just how much more complex the tapestry of American history truly is. That these stories that have been so long forgotten, these voices that were silenced, those belong to real people who had real pain and joy and triumph, and to realize that these are real, these aren't just mythic historic figures, but these are real people. And Liss was one of them, and she lived, and she had a name, and she had a story that is part of America. She is part of America.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. And thank you, ladies, so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Sure.